introduce my enormously valued colleague, Gail Kosnik.
All right. Thank you, Nicholas, and thank you everyone for being here this afternoon. This panel is on violence and free speech, and I'm going to be asking the question, what was the harm of Free Speech Week? Here are 3 chalk markings that were made on the north side of campus. They're all anti-immigrant, anti-queer messages. One says, build a wall, deport them all. All is underlined twice. The second one says in all caps, anti-fags, an insult directed at Antifa. The third one says in all caps, illegals, ICE is coming. Here are 2 students whose photos and identifying information Milo Yiannopoulos posted on Facebook and Instagram. One of them is an ASUC senator. Yiannopoulos incited his followers to harass them, which that has changed our definition of doxing a little bit. Doxing used to be releasing someone's social security number, their personal home address, releasing crucial information about them. But now I sense that the definition of doxing is turning into posting someone's real name and face and urging one's followers to harass them. The ASUC senator, the undergraduate pictured here, said, my existence as a brown transgender woman was put on display and ridiculed by thousands who commented with queer and transgender slurs, vulgar remarks, and death threats. And that was because they were posting in response to these chalk drawings. This is a poster calling UC Berkeley faculty members who are queer and people of color terrorist supporters. This is a letter sent to a UC Berkeley faculty member stating that the UC Berkeley campus will be, quote, will be safer if blacks are not on campus. Some of the text reads, greetings. News of your proposal to shut down your school during Free Speech Week has come to my attention. It appears that you and others fear for the safety of black students during that time. It appears that all students, underlined, will be safer if blacks are not on campus. Of course, some critics might claim that your real intent is to limit exposing students and others to the, quote, politically incorrect words and ideas of the scheduled speakers. After all, the heat of such ideas is all too likely to melt snowflakes. Here are a series of threats on Twitter directed at a UC Berkeley faculty member stating that that person will, quote, be fired or set on fire. And that faculty member is also characterized as part of the, quote, left-wing fascists and murderers on Twitter. Another quote among the tweets says, the most hostile people in America are left-wing fascists who want to murder people with differing opinions. And just to read the whole tweet that I mentioned first, as a student at Berkeley, which is misspelled and not capitalized, if you shut down their, which is also misspelled, appearance and get violent, period, you'll either be fired or set on fire. Here's a poster that literally says Students for Justice in Palestine equals Hamas, which is a terrorist group in the Middle East. Here are photographs and lecture slides of a UC Berkeley graduate student instructor, GSI, who's a person of color, posted to Milo Yiannopoulos' Facebook. There to the right is a close-up of the face of the instructor so that the Milo's followers on Facebook can see exactly who it is. And I didn't screenshot the thousands of comments urging harassment, that constitute harassment, but urging more harassment against this instructor, but they were there, believe me. Here's an email from a UC Berkeley faculty member, a queer person of color, who declined to participate today. I'm currently teaching a 100+ person lecture, and I already suspect that 2 of my students are taping my lectures and or posting pictures of my lecture slides to a right-wing social media site. In the current climate, I've actually curtailed my use of social media because frankly, I am afraid of being targeted and attacked either online or in person. As you probably heard, a grad student has already been doxxed. Another faculty member has received death threats. Participating in a faculty forum on the topic of free speech and social media would only heighten my fears of becoming a target. Furthermore, I know of no efforts on the part of the administration to provide legal or administrative support to faculty that become targets of these doxing campaigns, or to offer support to those of us that feel genuinely threatened. Given the current climate, I elect not to participate. Here's an op-ed in the Daily Cal 2 days ago about cuts to the critical theory program at the same time that millions have been spent on Security for Free Speech Week. The op-ed, which was written by 2 political science PhD students at UC Berkeley, states in part, "What will our identity as the home of free speech mean when the foundations of intelligent debate, the public university centers of research and teaching crumble beneath our feet? What value will unfettered speech have when we have lost our languages, literatures, and histories, and when the informed practice of critique has long been left behind? What sort of identity and legacy would we be defending then?" Here are some thoughts that I have about Free Speech Week and new media. The first thought is that this campus is being trolled by the alt-right. Second thought is that trolls wanted to perform through and at UC Berkeley because of the university's brand as the home of free speech. When trolls fight and win, you have been owned. We at UC Berkeley got owned by the alt-right. Alt-right trolling originates online. Physical trolling, consisting of events, marches, actions, and demonstrations, is organized online. Information and ideas circulate between members of the alt-right and to potential new members, meaning high school and college students, in a cybernetic feedback loop that connects the physical world to the digital world. Both the physical world and the digital world are part of the network. UC Berkeley did not grasp that the alt-right sought to make this campus a physical battleground in their cybernetic war. The university, in directing students to show resilience in the face of hate speech, missed the fact that the internet has facilitated very open discussions of health and harm. When our students articulate the harm done by hate speech, they are not being quote-unquote snowflakes. They are adhering to digital cultural norms. Here are some thoughts about Free Speech Week and performance studies. I'm housed in 2 departments. One of them is performance studies and the other is the Center for New Media. My thought is, we could have performed back to the trolls. 5 public universities refused to allow alt-right spokesperson Richard Spencer to speak on their campus. The University of Florida, Michigan State, Louisiana State, Texas A&M, and Penn State. Here's a quote from the president of Penn State, Eric Barron. Eric Barron cited safety concerns as the main reason for denying a request for Spencer to speak. Quote, "After critical assessment by campus police, in consultation with state and federal law enforcement officials, we have determined that Mr. Spencer is not welcome on our campus. As this event at this time presents a major security risk to students, faculty, staff, and visitors to campus. It is the likelihood of disruption and violence, not the content, however odious, that drives our decision." And here's another way we could have performed back. This performance was given by Lieutenant J. Silveria, Superintendent of the Air Force Academy, which is also an educational institution, after racial slurs targeting Black cadets were written on whiteboards outside cadets' dorm rooms at the Air Force Prep School. These are from his remarks last Friday. That kind of behavior has no place at the prep school. It has no place at USAFA, and it has no place in the United States Air Force. You should be outraged, not only as airmen, but as human being. The appropriate response for horrible language and horrible ideas is a better idea. I have a better idea, and it's about our diversity. It's the power that we come from all walks of life, that we come from all parts of this country, that we come from all races, that we come from all backgrounds, gender, all makeup, all upbringing. The power of that diversity comes together and makes us that much more powerful. If you can't treat someone from another race or different color skin with dignity and respect, then you need to get out. Okay, that's my introduction to this panel, and now I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Jung Yi. I'm literally going to read her bio that she wrote word for word. Dr. Jung Yi wants you to know that she wrote this brief bio for me to read aloud to you, so that she can take full responsibility for what I'm about to say. She currently works at UHS, University Health Services, as a counselor. She primarily practices cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, from a multicultural orientation. She also co-teaches an Education 98 course called Divergent Thinking, and continues to teach painting in the community. She wanted to let you all know that she has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, and a learning disability, has not taken her Adderall this evening, and is quite excited to be here in her naturally divergent state. On her way here, she thought this may have been some kind of mistake to be on this panel, as she got rejected from UC Berkeley at the age of 18 and resented this great institution for the next 15 years until they finally accepted her after 3 degrees. Now she is quite fond of Oski the bear. Her UC Berkeley colleagues, many of whom did attend Cal, gently point out to her when she puts this fact into her intros that technically she didn't get into Berkeley but got hired to work here. On a good day, Dr. Yi responds to this by pretending she did not hear them, and then goes on proudly to tell everyone who will listen that she finally got into Cal. She is now sitting on stage wondering if this bio was a bit TMI, but figures it's all too late to stop now. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jung Yi.
Thanks, Abby. Gail, my ADD. All right. Okay. So I also dropped out of law school, and I'm somewhat relieved that our new dean of the law school is not here today, because that's how I was going to build rapport, by sharing with him that I dropped out of law school. And so I did bring his book, hoping he would sign it and then sell it on eBay to pay my rent. But that didn't work out. But if you see him, let him know I'm looking for him. Here's my warning, trigger warning, and I'm going to kind of give you the advice I received for today's talk from my friends, family, and well-meaning colleagues, of course. Number 1, Jung, you are not Margaret Cho. You're not that funny. That's why you went and got a doctorate in clinical psychology. 2, the mic is not a cue for singing karaoke. Nobody wants to hear you sing Cher for the 45th time. This is from Alex. I tried Alex. Alex said, Jung, please, please stick to 3 talking points. You want to work here for a long time. We're going to retire together, okay? And then, of course, lastly, this was multiple people. Make sure you take your Adderall. So I didn't. I'm not very good at taking advice. So instead, I'm going to read you a story that I've titled, Creating a Safe Space Within to Address the Violence Within. Chapter 1. My grandmother was visiting from Jeju Island, a small island off South Korea, when I was about 5 or 6. She wanted to go buy a doll for a family friend, so my mother and I took her to a toy store in California. I watched her very carefully as she browsed through the aisles. Then I looked up to see her reach for a doll with black hair and dark brown skin. I thought quietly to myself, Grandma, that's not the one you want. The little girl who is going to get it is not going to like her because she's not pretty. She doesn't look like my Barbies or my Disney princess dolls. I felt surprised, confused, and even irritated by her purchase. Chapter 2. In elementary school, my grandmother came for another visit, and she decided to chaperone one of my school trips to the Bay, actually. I was on a train to Monterey, and she had packed some Korean snacks, dry squid specifically, and was talking to me in Korean, asking question after question about how to say this word in English and this word in English. I remember feeling deeply ashamed, and ashamed that I was feeling ashamed. I said, Grandma, please lower your voice. Why did you bring this smelly Korean food? Please put it away. And then I pretended to be asleep, closed my eyes for the rest of the train ride. Chapter 3, My senior year of college, my best friend called me. She said, "Jung, I'm gay." I was silent, and it seemed to last forever. She finally broke the silence by saying, "Are you still my friend?" I felt a sharp pain and a desperate desire to protect her, and I immediately responded, "Of course, I will always be your friend." The truth of it is, I don't think I was very present for the next decade of her life as she connected with her chosen family, dated women, attended events, LGBTQ rights, and even contemplated transitioning to F to M. Chapter 4. This past summer, I took a flight to SoCal. As I entered the plane, I heard a high-pitched voice in the cockpit and assumed a flight attendant was talking to the pilot. I did a double take when I observed the voice belonged to a female pilot talking to a male flight attendant. I felt a small but distinct rush of anxiety and had 1 hour to CBT myself, cognitive behavioral therapy. I examined my automatic thoughts, the thoughts that were creating this anxiety, the thoughts that I do not have much control over. They just pop into my head, they just rush into my head, and I will share some of them with you. She is too pretty to be a pilot. Can she fly this plane okay? Does she have experience? What if there's turbulence? Can she remain calm? Then I felt disgusted with my automatic thoughts. I took a few deep breaths and continued to CBT myself and came up with some alternative thoughts. It's rare that I ever see female pilots. It's rare that I see female leaders in institutions such as this. It's rare to see female scientists and engineers and a lot of other some things. How hard she must have worked to join a male-dominated field. She's such an example for young women who are aspiring pilots. She inspires me. I felt calmer, more forgiving of myself, and inspired. Chapter 5. As a social justice-oriented counselor who practiced multicultural counseling, I start my first session with my diverse clients with the following disclaimer. Before we begin our work together, I want to be honest with you. I am straight, Korean American, have ADHD, and I'm working on my internalized racism, internalized homophobia, sexism, and many, many other isms. Please call me out on my microaggressions. Initially, I'll be a bit hurt and slightly defensive, but I will come around and I'll own it. I can promise you that I'm working hard on being more aware of my internal processes. I am work in progress and will continue to be work in progress until the day I die. My clients here at Cal, Berkeley students, have shown me such grace, and we have done some really great work together. Chapter 6. I was walking downtown to my private practice after a long day at the I House. I do some counseling there, and came across a little girl, 5 to 6. She had apricot skin hues. She was holding a little doll with sepia skin hues and ebony hair. I felt the all too familiar surprise. And then I felt warm and satisfied. It's okay, that I would do that too. I have ADHD. Don't be shy, all right? No judgment. I took a moment to observe my automatic thoughts and my alternative thoughts. Berkeley is a special place for me. I am filled with wonder, sometimes pain, and a lot of hope. I see waves of ideas crashing into rocks, of knowledge, values, and art. I see students shaping students, students teaching staff like myself, students inspiring faculty, students challenging administration to be greater. I feel very fortunate to be here today. And I want to share with you this picture. I was born in Jeju Island in the 70s. And it's considered, this place, one of the 10 wonders of the world. It makes that list, derivations of that list. But I would like to tell you, these are porous volcanic rocks, and water just hits them at very different angles. And so when you see them, it's really quite amazing. They stand tall, they're angular, they take a lot of waves and a lot of hits from a lot of different directions. I share with you all, damn, it was hard getting here, people. Berkeley is one of my 10 wonders of the world. And I hope that it is for you too. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you very much, Gail.
Our next speaker is Jill Miller. Jill Miller is an art practitioner and professor who works collaboratively with communities and individuals. Her recent artwork explores motherhood through a lens of feminism and performance, and her work takes shape across many forms and disciplines. In the past, she searched for Bigfoot in the Sierra Nevada, inserted herself into the art historical work of John Baldessari, and became a private investigator who performed surveillance on art collectors. Her largest scale community engagement project, the Milk Truck, reached tens of thousands of people around the world via social media and publications. Her work has been shown nationally and internationally and collected in public institutions worldwide, including CA2M, Centro de Arte dos de Mayo in Madrid, and the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden. She also received an individual engagement grant from the Wikimedia Foundation for the socially engaged art project, Women of Wikipedia, or WOW, which aimed to help close the gender gap by teaching high school-aged women how to edit Wikipedia articles. Jill currently teaches activism and digital fabrication courses at UC Berkeley and Stanford. Please join me in welcoming Jill Miller.
Hello. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I got here, and then more importantly, I'll talk about my student projects from my class, Critical Practices, which is part of the Berkeley Center for New Media curriculum. So I came to Berkeley actually as an undergraduate in the 90s. I had grown up in a small farm town in rural Illinois. Actually, it was only 35 miles south of Chicago, but when I grew up, it was rural. I think now there's a little bit more of maybe some suburban movement there. And essentially, I wanted to come to Berkeley when I was younger because to me, coming from the Midwest, from a conservative little town, Berkeley represented so much of what I yearned for but couldn't find at home. Not just academic excellence, which we all hear about, but also passionate discourse, inclusivity, the right to exercise free expression, the practice of critical thinking, the right to fly your freak flag when and where you need to. And these were always things that I assumed were going on with this kind of continual exchange within our communities about how we can live in a world of difference together with integrity and fairness. I went on to study at UCLA for graduate school, and now I'm here, Bay Area artist and a lecturer at Cal, also at Stanford. I teach classes on digital fabrication, activism, and public art practices. In my personal practice, I collaborate with different communities and individuals, and sometimes the work is contentious and even controversial. Back in the day when Yahoo clubs existed, they censored my artwork and removed it from a club. And later, when I built the Milk Truck, a breastfeeding advocacy truck in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, I was told by my son's conservative Pennsylvanian school that I couldn't pick him up in that truck after school. We left that school, and then we left the state. Sometimes I feel an obligation to make certain works that stand up for certain rights, especially if I know they may be challenging to people and even to myself. This campus and its legacy literally helped me kind of solidify the person that I am today. And I feel like I talk the talk, but I also walk the walk. And I do think a part of it, not to be overly sentimental, but I do think a part of it is the kind of almost upbringing I had at Berkeley as opposed to the place where I kind of started from. And then enough about me. I want to talk more about my students. So teaching studio art and design is tricky because you can't really teach someone how to make good art. You can teach them how to use materials or tools, and you can teach them about art history and theory, but there really isn't a formula for making a great work of art, and it's probably because artists don't really know that formula themselves. So what we can do, and this is one of my student projects, Who Wore It Better, Trump or the Corn. What we can do, though, is help students create a toolkit that can use and apply in a variety of situations in art and life these different principles. So in my students' toolkits, they have a number of items. From my class, maybe laser cutting and 3D printing, but also ethnographic interviewing, critical thinking, which I'm sure they brought to it themselves, skepticism, activism, empathy, and humor, as you can see here. And I'll give you a short sampling of some of the projects that have come out of critical practices, and I only have time for a few. Created in 2015, this is the UC system, spelled Y-O-U-S-E-E, right, clever. And it provided a viewing station which was aimed at the Chancellor's private residence while a fence was being constructed around it. You might remember that. And in order to use this tower viewer, the students requested a donation of 32 cents rather than the standard 25 cents, mirroring the proposed tuition hikes at that time in percentage. Another project, in 2016, I had a group of students create the whitewashing Hollywood machine, which magnified a Hollywood casting practice in which Asian roles and stories are filled with white actors. There's also this added issue of the white savior narrative in which the white character rescues people of color from their troubles. And this interactive washing machine allowed participants to put Asian actors into a washing machine, turn on the cycle, and then they'd receive this white actor in return. Reveal the Truth was also part of my fall 2016 class, and it was made during the presidential election. And it's a game that highlighted the difficulty of detecting a fake news story when you were looking at headlines alone. And if you got it correct, they would Velcro on this cow patch. And then if you guessed incorrectly, you got a Stanford patch on yours. So, and then for the diversity project, I had some female students from electrical engineering and computer science in my class. And they observed that only 11% of the faculty were women. And so they installed empty portraits, which would be a future faculty member that would be hired in the entryway of Corey Hall. And they asked students to vote on what kind of person they'd like to see in its place. So you'd pick up like a little tag with a different shape or color and set it up depending on what you wanted. Some of the choices you could pick were an immigrant, a person of color, somebody who was differently abled, a woman, LGBTQ. They were ultimately questioned by the staff and told to remove their project. But this, I think I have the, I think my classes win the record for the most confiscated projects, which I'm really proud of. And so, the students who were sitting outside today, I hope you got to talk with some of them. I was actually a little surprised that many people wouldn't talk with them. They didn't want to sit down. But they set up this, a picnic, a campsite, and a cafe environment. And they're from my critical practices class, the same class that did the other three projects I showed you. And they developed these public or private inside public spaces in order to facilitate personal connections in a time of turbulence on our campus. And so we had lots of conversation about the meaning of the work. And For us, the class and I, the project I think opens up some doors for conversation while closing off the need for agitating and violence. They employ a radical, deep listening or eloquent listening in a time when everyone wants their voice to be heard, but in the binary nature of protests, the individual voice is lost in the kerfuffle of us versus them. And then I'll just close by saying one of the questions that we had was, what does it mean to exercise eloquent listening in a time of free speech? I don't have any answers for you, but that's it. Thank you.
And now please join me in welcoming our final speaker, who will introduce herself.
Hello. As you all, of course, know, once again, I'm Carol Christ, Chancellor of UC Berkeley. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are on Ohlone land and that I'm a settler on that land. Many of you heard my opening comments earlier today. Now, I believe in a human capacity for change and transformation. Upon some deep reflection and careful conversation with students, I want to retract almost all of my earlier comments. I have concluded that this administration made a significant error in judgment. Let me be straightforward and connect to you person to person. Students, I am sorry. I am so sorry. Free Speech Week was a mistake. I made a mistake. Today, I move in support of our most vulnerable communities and against racism, white supremacy, and ethno-nationalism in all of its grotesquely explicit and insidiously implicit forms. Let's come back to this question of whose speech is free. The speech espoused on this campus as free has actually been quite expensive, and I would like to acknowledge some of the funders. Hedge fund billionaire Robert Mercer is a major investor behind Milo Yiannopoulos. The billionaire Koch brothers and Amway billionaires Richard and Helen DeVos, who back the Young America's Foundation, are sponsors of the college campus circuits of David Horowitz, Ann Coulter, and Ben Shapiro. So while some speech is being funded by billionaires, who is funding the speech of marginalized students on campus? I would like to raise up some piercing analysis on this subject from the students of ethnic studies here at Berkeley from their statement against racism, white supremacy, and hate speech at UC Berkeley. It's very good. The ethnic studies community knows the value of free speech. We remember that the free speech movement was about the disenfranchisement and civil rights of Black people, as well as the militant organizing against white supremacy in the United States. We remember that the free speech movement was more about the liberation of people of color in the US and the right to speak freely on campus. We remember that in the 1968 to 69 Third World Liberation Front strike, it became the longest and bloodiest student strike in US history. We remember that our spaces were won despite the fact that Berkeley police, along with the National Guard, beat, shot, and gassed students, staff, and community members with batons, guns, and helicopters. We remember that even though our spaces exist, they are not guaranteed to us under the banner of free speech. And we remember that we must constantly demand and defend the spaces we have won and the spaces from which we will continue to organize against white supremacy, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, misogynist, sexist, anti-Black, anti-immigrant violence promoted by white supremacists. I would like to respond as Chancellor to this powerful work and agree that I should have canceled Free Speech Week. I should have denounced racism, hate speech, and violence on our campus, and I intend to do so moving forward. Now, earlier today, I suggested that Ben Shapiro's event was a proper speech event, while Milo Yiannopoulos' event was a mere digital shadow. Since this morning, I have had fruitful discussions with media scholars and student activists, and I asked Professor Kosnik if I might amend my earlier statement in these closing remarks. I have learned from you gracious scholars of media that there is in fact not such a binary between what I might have understood as the shadow and the real. this digital violence has material repercussions, and that as a leader, albeit a non-elected one, it is my duty to work for the dignity and liberation of those facing the most dire circumstances on this campus. Ben Shapiro, apparently, is actually a homophobic, racist rape denier, and his speech, sharing his speech, is not a normal speech event. His speech in our very own Zellerbach Hall shut down classes, made campus dangerous for queer people and survivors of sexual violence, and the militarization, police state, and arrests of students greatly impeded learning on campus. Secondly, framing Milo, whom we know in the area of media studies as the creator of the violent digital harassment tactic known as doxing, and his visit as a shadow, does not take accountability for the vast disruption his Free Speech Week caused across our campus. I now understand that Free Speech Week endangered the physical, not just the shadow, safety of students on this campus. When marginalized students and faculty are being targeted, intimidated, doxxed, and otherwise harassed for doing their work, this is not an issue that can be solved by more speech. Doxing compromises the physical and material safety, as Gail so eloquently described and showed us directly. It causes real emotional and potential physical harm and can compound pre-existing trauma, depression, isolation, and suicidality. Students' speech and labor are being actively repressed by heavily funded alt-right terrorizing. When students and their families face threats to physical safety for holding different beliefs, do they have freedom of expression? Or does their lack of presence at a conference such as this demonstrate that freedom of speech debate is a ruse fully co-opted by white supremacists that must be immediately dismantled? Faculty and students are unable to do their work on a campus so aligned with white supremacy, and this was the foundation of the boycott during Free Speech Week. I would like to make an immediate and public commitment towards dismantling the racist violence UC Berkeley perpetuates on a daily basis against its students, faculty, and campus workers. Here is my commitment to you. We move towards establishing accountability to Indigenous communities for UC Berkeley's violent history. We will immediately repatriate the 10,000 remains that are being stored in Kroeber Hall and issue a public apology for UC Berkeley's shameful history. In dialogue with Indigenous communities, we will create an official land acknowledgement and work toward making this a regular function of all campus events. We will take concrete steps to dismantle the anti-Blackness of our campus. This includes hiring more Black faculty, listening to the articulated needs of Black students, and active outreach into communities that surround our campus. Enrollment of Black students on this campus has fallen to less than 3%. This is unacceptable, and clearly the result of Black students not feeling welcome and supported on this campus. We will make our campus compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act and reinstate programs cut from the Disabled Students Program. I will institute immediate investment in mandatory in-person anti-racism training for all students, graduate students, faculty, staff, and administrators. We will immediately disarm campus police and all mutual aid security forces hired to protect speakers who incite hate and violence against academic student employees and other students and workers on campus. We will ensure that no ICE officers will be allowed to endanger academic student employees and other students and workers on this campus. Now, in order to fund these changes, we will commit an equal amount of funds that were poured into mounting the police presence to protect white supremacist speakers, into funding for students of color, disabled students, and poor students. Why are we, I ask myself, spending over $1 million protecting white supremacists when we have students who are homeless, hungry, or working multiple jobs to afford this education we've promised them? The answer is, of course, simple. Let's not do that anymore. Now, I would like to speak for a minute about a sponsoring organization of this conference, BridgeCal. And we should all just know that BridgeCal, while maintaining that it is a neutral organization that is interested in a marketplace of ideas, is also the organization responsible for inviting Ann Coulter, homophobic, racist, anti-Muslim speaker, to campus. So, is this conference right here a neutral space? when sponsored by such an organization? Is this even a nonviolent space? I want to assert, I'm just gonna, excuse me. I want to assert that Richtown does not represent me as Chancellor, nor does it own me with its deep pockets. In fact, as a metaphor, a kind of shadow gesture, I would like to just briefly and kind of gently set this aside, just for a couple of minutes. Yes. We are often taught, and we teach, that our minds are more important to our bodies than our bodies in our classrooms. And yet, when our bodies are physically unsafe or unable to be present in our places of learning, there is no way for education to occur. I refuse to build a campus where we are forcing students to leave their bodies behind. We are not shadows. We are all breathing, living bodies, deserving of respect and dignity. Digital violence is violence. Police violence and its specter are violence. And there will be no more of either on this campus.
My question is, first of all, thank you all so much for all that you've offered. I think there's just so much to think about. My question is really for the first speaker. Thank you for talking about this perspective of supporting students on campus who are undergoing, I think, extensive kind of trauma. I'm just wondering if you can share a little bit about what that's felt like for folks, like especially around events like Free Speech Week and about Ben Shapiro, I'm sure the Islamophobia, the escalation of all kinds of oppressions. I'm just wondering if you can share out a little bit about what that's looked like from your perspective and what the support work and demands have been for folks.
So, do you mean me, first speaker? Me?
I do,
Oh, okay.
yeah, thank you.
I was wondering if you could break down your very great question one at a time so that I can follow.
Yeah, I'm mostly wondering about events like Free Speech Week, if you've seen an escalation in need.
Well, I can speak for the counseling center at Tang. Those questions you're more than welcome to ask their department. I think of maybe Claudia, who's a director. She'll be a good person to ask for the efforts made by the counseling center. I can tell you that as a therapist working at the iHouse and also as a counselor seeing students for regular therapy, certainly campus culture does impact students' like mental health. When I spoke earlier about internalized ism, the work that I do with students inside a therapy session is to really look at how we have a lot of internalized voices that are quite violent against ourselves. And when that's met up against other voices that are loud in terms of auditory or presence, it can be very triggering. And so changing the world takes time. I'm not really quite sure how to do that myself. But as a clinician, what I can do is look at how to center yourself and look at the automatic thoughts that are creating anxiety, fear, stress that impact education, learning, memory, and how to come up with empowering alternative thoughts to normalize our own internalized isms and give ourselves grace so that we can be in a place to hear others who can both comfort and challenge. I can talk forever, so I'm not even sure, when I was a kid, I was one of those art students, I had a disability, so there was a circle, and then we're supposed to cut the circle out of the paper. And most students would just kind of take their scissor, make a sharp incision, and then start cutting the circle. I was there for 4 hours, cutting layer after layer around the circle, crying my eyes out and saying, I'm cutting, and I can't get to the circle. And so hopefully, this was my attempt at answering your question. Thank you.
Let's have more questions, or also just feedback, comments, reactions, emotions.
Hi, thank you all for your talks and comments. Just given the name of the panel, I was wondering if there are any political acts of violence that any of you would support. It's not meant to be an aggressive question. There's obviously right now within both the political right and the political left, with very different consequences and with very different approaches, acts of violence. Some of them are thought of as progressive acts of violence. There's a lot of support for groups like Antifa. Antifa is obviously the kind of main group that gets attention associated with violence on the left, but maybe there are other types of violence that you would support or not support. I'm not encouraging violence in any way, but I'm interested in your responses. If you think there are any acts of violence that you consider politically important or politically progressive or politically in support of the kinds of things that you would like to see happen.
For myself, I'll say no. I don't support violence of any kind, and I will also say that this is the violence panel. Look at this panel. I thought it was so funny. We were supposed to have other kinds of people on this panel, but I do think if I had to pick out the 4 least likely to commit violent people in this room, I think I might pick the people on this panel. So I'm going to say no, that we're not a violent panel, but if anybody wants to throw in with other thoughts about that. Oh, all right, Dr. E.
So I believe it was at an all-staff meeting. The counselors were together discussing kind of campus culture, how we can support our students. And I think this is what I said, but I might have altered it over time because I was fixated on this comment for a very long time. It made me kind of anxious after I made it. But I said that, as counselors, it's very important to welcome all students with all political views, and especially if there's a student who's quite passionate, that the only way for change is to exercise violence against oneself or others. It's even more important that we sit with that person to hear where they're coming from. I would say that I support people who have violent thoughts. As a counselor especially, I welcome people who are having violent thoughts to talk it out with someone who really hears where they're coming from, where some of their hurt is coming from, and if they're having difficulty finding other ways to express that. So I'm not sure if this answers your question, but I do support people who are experiencing a lot of violence inside, violent thoughts against others. So come look for me if you're having these thoughts. Hopefully this doesn't get me in trouble with the counseling center. I'm kind of a liability when I don't take my Adderall. But certainly you can come in and ask for Dr. E.
I'm trying to think of something violent I support. Like this whole time, I really want to answer your question, but I can't think of anything. But if I do, I'll let you know, for sure.
Yes, I think that it matters what you mean by violence. I have used particular framing around violence in some of my mass emails that you can't reply to. And, there's violence against people, and then there's violence against things like windows. So, is the latter violence if it prevents the former? I think it's a good question.
Hi, I have trouble reconciling what I see among our student community of it seeming like many of the same students that advocate for some level of censorship of some types of speech that are injurious, psychologically and offensive in many ways, seem to be the same students in a lot of cases that are also pro-Antifa. So how do you see that in your student interactions, and how do we deal with that? How do we deal with the fact that the same students that want to censor some speech are also the same students that are willing to take any kind of steps, including violent steps, to censor that speech.
I just want to clarify what the Chancellor just said about windows, that when Milo Yiannopoulos came in February for a scheduled speech, that there was a group of Black Bloc members, which is a local Antifa group, that prevented the speech from taking place by moving towards the barriers that were around the building and picking up some of those barriers and throwing them at windows. And that act led to the cancellation of Milo's speech. And I just want to reiterate what the Chancellor just said, that violence against windows is not violence against people. That I'm just clarifying the last statement. And that's just to gloss this conversation around Antifa. As for Antifa, that is not a UC Berkeley institution. I've never spoken with any student about any kind of membership in that organization. I'm very aware there is an overlap between UC Berkeley members at all levels and that group. But I don't really have, personally, I don't have any thoughts around how to speak to Antifa in a way that would change their tactics. For me, as a professor, this is a place of learning, and my priority is tending to the students of UC Berkeley. So what they do in their spare time is up to them, but what I try to encourage is deliberative, democratic discourse and dialogue among students, and I think that all of our classrooms that we teach in this panel do a good job of that, and that we don't censor speech in our classrooms. So how to fight censorship outside of spaces that we control, I think, is a very good question for the society. We all should think of that question, these large questions of censorship. But I will just say that I don't think of censorship as a UC Berkeley problem or issue.
I would say I also have never had a student tell me that they were a member of Antifa or any political group. For sure, I see student projects that are more politically left, as you might expect at a place like Berkeley, and I think it's probably obvious to my students where I sit politically, but I would say that for me, I feel that as an artist and a faculty member, it's like my duty to, like I said before, give them some kind of toolkit to express themselves. And to me, it doesn't matter where they're coming from. I'm not really in a position to judge that. So I want them to be makers, to have opinions and be able to make the kind of public art that they want to make. And if a student did a project in my class that was around that, I would probably be okay with it, but I'd also be okay with a student who was on the far right making work, because I don't believe in censoring people, which I would say, particularly in a classroom, you have to be really careful of how you handle those things. But anytime I've had students that have wanted to do projects that seemed maybe like edging a little bit closer in one direction or the other, like maybe a little bit closer to some kind of extremist position, I've always had students come and talk with me and say, I want to work in this certain area. I know it's a sensitive area, and this is the way I'm going at it. And so I've been a sounding board where I've said, this is how this will be received. If you do this, this is how it's read in public. But ultimately, I'm not making decisions for them. I guess, if that answers.
I have a bit more to say, but does anybody else want to? I have a bit more to say about just difficult discussions in classrooms, especially when students of different political orientations come into conflict with each other, or say things that incite each other's anger or annoyance or frustration. I've had a lot of success, and this is really just, now I'll talk about teaching, but I've had a lot of success just hearing people, just listening to them and connecting with them. And I often say when students rise up in debate, I look at each, I know this sounds silly, but I look at each of them in the eye and I say, I hear you, and I hear you too. And this, what's happening, is so hard, and it is so complicated, and you both bring a lot of history to this moment. So just honor how tough we have it right now, and that we're engaged in really trying to see each other and hear each other. And let's go from there. Let's go from a position of honoring each other and our past histories and what we bring to this moment. And I've had such success with students not agreeing with each other, but seriously just feeling received, just feeling recognized and heard. And I do think that we do our best to make our classrooms safe spaces in whatever definition you want to give around that. The definition I would give is that people can learn from each other, from people that are very different from them, in a way that doesn't bring anybody in the classroom any harm. That is my definition. So.
I promised a colleague I wouldn't do the unicorn talk, but I'm gonna just do it because I'm just inspired to make that story happen. Feelings are not mysterious things. They're always coming from thoughts. So when you're feeling fear, anxiety, hatred, disgust, if you take a moment and write down all of the automatic thoughts that were going through your head, then your feelings will start to make a lot of sense. If we judge each other on those automatic thoughts that come from the feelings, it's going to be really difficult to have discourse, to really get at each other's argument, or to really understand each other. And so the challenges that I share with my students is, what are your alternative thoughts? So after that immediate reaction where you want to curse someone out, where you want to kick a trash can, I do this often. I kick trash cans when no one's looking, and then I feel guilty, and then I put it back up, and then I check to see if there's cameras. I've gotten kind of paranoid here at Berkeley. And then after that initial kind of expression, if you sit down and then do a step 2 and think of alternative thoughts, both parties will probably be ready to have a more honest discourse. I can tell you, I do CBT every minute of every hour, especially when I'm doing counseling, when I'm interacting with students, when I'm watching anything media related. I'm just looking and observing and hearing all the thoughts that are going in my head. And the feelings that result from it, it goes from horror, like Stephen King, that ain't that scary. And I'm just looking at all these images and all my reactions. And then I say, okay, enough is enough. I'm a CBT therapist. They gave me this certificate. I should apply it to myself. And then I'll say, what are my alternative thoughts? Based on rational thinking. That's balanced. And then it does really help. So if any of you want to learn CBT, you all have great insurance if you're connected with UC Berkeley. Go find a CBT therapist in the community.
Hi, so I really like the discussion so far. So this is not based off of any research. This is just more so my own perspective and observations. So do you have any thoughts on what can be done? So from my observation, it seems like there's a duality between toxic masculinity for males and then women's emotional work burden. And it seems like the fight for both sides for gaining recognition and dealing with both issues are conflicting one another. For example, males want recognition from others, including females, and help guide them through toxic masculinity and open up and discuss emotions. But females at the same time are dealing with talking through emotional work burden, and when they feel, I can see how, with the duality, males coming to females for help, to the females feel like an extension of the emotional burden, and then males on the other end trying to reach out for help with toxic masculinity feel like they're being shut down, and then it's kind of creating this situation where both sides feel like they're being wronged and that the other side's being hypocritical. Do you see any, what are your thoughts on that? And feel free to disagree, and is there any way out of this?
What an amazing question. Thank you for that question. This is powerful. Let's talk about toxic masculinity and the emotional work burden that women carry. Okay. I will say I completely understand that question. Just really quickly, when I teach patriarchy and feminism, I usually just try to explain that patriarchy hurts men too. Patriarchy hurts the whitest, straightest, richest, most male man. It hurts that person as much as it hurts any woman, because it is so limiting. It is really just about a role that society imposes on you that is so rigid and so limiting. And so the answer to that is to just try to break out of the social limits and try to embrace other kinds of identities that you can have. That's just a brief gloss on my approach to toxic masculinity. I also want to say that in response to any two sides that cannot really reconcile with each other, anytime you have this opposition, I really recommend reading the chapter of Borderlands La Frontera by Gloria Anzaldúa called Mestiza Consciousness. There is literally a reference to white supremacy in this essay where Gloria Anzaldúa says, you can stand on one side of the riverbank and you can shout at the other side of the riverbank as much as you want to, how much you hate them, how much they're not you. You can shout at the white supremacists over there. But what mestiza consciousness means, which is a mixed consciousness, a hybrid consciousness, a multi-perspectival consciousness, what that means is eventually you're gonna have to get on the other side of the riverbank. And actually you're gonna have to find a way to be on both sides of the riverbank at the same time. So that may sound like this overwork of emotional, the burden that women carry, which is like, oh, we have to be on both sides of the riverbank. Like we have to figure out a way to do that. But Anzaldúa says we all do. We all have to figure out a way to do that. And if women of color are the first people to figure out how to stand on both sides of the riverbank, that's okay. That's good. That means that somebody's leading, somebody's teaching. And so, but I don't think that it's necessarily any one group that's gonna lead that project. I think we all can practice standing on both sides of the riverbank and seeing a lot of actions from a lot of perspectives that are not our own. And we can incorporate other perspectives into our own and come at them with a sense of compassion and even a kind of identification, with somebody with exactly the opposite views to you. Anyone else on toxic masculinity and the emotional work that women do? we can talk, email us. We can talk more later about that. Great question. Any questions about violence?
Oh, I guess this isn't a question about violence. But I feel like on this campus there's a bit of a divide between students that are very engaged in activism and students that are really in their work and they don't have time to think about things like this, or they haven't been properly exposed. So do you think it's possible to teach someone to care about current events like this and really to engage with their campus? Like, do you think it's kind of like an innate interest, or do you think you can teach that?
I love that question. And I've had this conversation with other artists who deal with political activism. And I would say everybody is an activist of some kind. And I'm going to use like an old example that you've probably heard a million times. But this is what I've said to my students, and probably some of them who are here are like, yes, again. But if you cycle to school and every day you cycle the same route and you keep hitting that same damn pothole, and then finally you're like, I'm gonna call someone in the city to fix that fucking pothole, or I'm gonna just like fill it with Legos so the next time someone else goes over it, they see it and they're like, someone else got mad and fixed it. That's a type of activism. And so I would say I teach not just to like my students, but to my kids, this idea that even if something is tiny, in fact, especially if it's tiny, it should be more approachable. Because when we think about these larger wicked world problems, like world hunger and homelessness, that stuff overwhelms people and then they do nothing. So we have to start in these little incremental steps and then, feel our power in that, and then we do bigger projects. That's what I would say.
Great question. What's your name? Do you mind?
Leela.
Leela. I'm just gonna say it. When I try to think on how I'm gonna sound smart, I've been warned that I don't make any sense, so I'm just gonna be myself. I have good friends who tell me when you try to use an SAT word, you use it out of context and you say the very opposite thing you're trying to say, and it confuses everyone but yourself. So I'll just be me. I think that you know, everyone has the power to want to be protective, to protect another. Certainly, if you have positive feelings for family members or friends, there's this desire. But what I've noticed is when you don't have that connection with someone with an identity, then it's easier to not really want to protect and to maybe just go to your room, shut the door. And that's one point. Another thing is, if you're walking around with visible identities, like you're a person of color, you're a woman, maybe you have a disability that's visible, it's hard to escape not supporting yourself through a system that might be challenging. So then you're caught doing it anyway, just to survive or to thrive. And so I would just like to urge you, if you notice someone who's not quite activated or who's not involved in activism, try connecting with that person and sharing your story. And I can tell you that, you know, I work a lot harder for my friends and what my friends care about. And it's just true. There's so many great things to support and so many great causes that sometimes it does feel a little overwhelming to support it all. And at the end of the day, I do a lot of emotional labor. I'm a clinician, I'm a woman. And then when I have to pick and choose, I'll definitely choose to support people who are dear to me, students, colleagues, and my clients and family members. So I hope that's helpful in some way.
Those are such inspiring responses. I wanted to thank you. Yes, I think it's really lovely to consider that activism does not always mean taking action in a specific way, showing up at a protest or instigating a discussion. Activism can work in different ways that are perhaps gendered and racialized, such as cooking dinner for someone you love who had a hard day. It can be providing emotional labor, helping to undo someone's toxic masculinity. There's a variety of ways that activism can play out, and all of the activism that involves showing up at a protest also needs support too. Like every individual who does an action also needs someone to care for them. So I don't know, just thinking about care and work. Yeah.
Chancellor, do you think someone showing up to a public event, impersonating or performing as a powerful figure, is that a type of activism?
What a confusing question. I'm not sure I've ever seen that before. But I would love to see some of your student art if that's what you're referring to.
I love the term you use, which is eloquent listening. And I was wondering...
Oh, that's from this morning's talk, this morning's keynote address. Robert Reich called for that.
Oh, I missed it. But I was wondering how you think the university as a whole can move forward to promote eloquent listening.
Yeah, I did steal that from the keynote, but great artists steal. No, I'm just kidding. But I mean, I think that, you know, I was talking, I got to meet like one of my art heroes the other day, Tanya Bruguera, who has a show at Yerba Buena. And we were talking a lot about, so she's Cuban, and so we were talking, she's like, what's going on at Berkeley's campus? You know, she's a politically active artist, incredible person. but she kind of wanted me to get the lowdown. So I'm like, well, 1964. Yeah, I started, and she's like, no, like right now. And so, I was kind of explaining to her about the challenges we're having with the violence, and she was like, why don't you just set up a debate? And I'm like, well, who gets to debate? And then she's like, yeah, you're right. And then I was like, well, what if it was just only students that were allowed to? Like, none of the pundits, none of the, institutional employees like me or whatever. Like, what if there was some, I guess what I'm saying is, I think students need to be allowed to have more space for their ideas to play out. And I don't know how to make that happen. I'm only like partly part of the institution because I'm a lecturer, okay? but I do feel like we need to give students more space. I don't know if I answered that correctly. But. To promote eloquently. Totally, yeah. I mean, I think that, I don't know, I feel like there's the kind of institutional speak towards them. For example, the way the Chancellor can't be replied to. Like, there are certain institutional ways of speaking that feel like very exclusive, and I do think that that type of listening can happen when the students have more power, I guess.
Oh, leadership by the students. Interesting.
I do think we're seeing a lot of great things come out of this moment. As hard as this moment has been, I think we are seeing students express themselves in a lot of new ways. And I'm excited, and we're about to end, but I'm excited by the creativity that students are showing, by the energy that students are showing, and by the modes of expression that they're finding in the digital space and in the physical world. I hope that what we can teach by creating spaces of dialogue in our classrooms, I hope what we are teaching is the kind of critical thinking and just the sort of protocols of conversation that allow students to engage with each other really creatively in a way that doesn't harm one another, that doesn't do violence of any kind to one another, because I really deeply believe that absolutely can be done. And I think our students are taking steps towards that, but as with any new project, we're really just at the dawn of the digital age. And as we're learning these multiple modes of expression that are just arising now, and we're making those modes, now is the time for us to wrestle with what does it mean to communicate multimodally. And it's hard, it's rough in the early going, but in 25 or 30 years' time, we'll have this multimodal thing down, We'll be able to go between the virtual network and the physical, real, embodied network much more easily, much more fluidly, and we'll have many more cultural norms around that exchange. And then we'll have to deal with nano, and other things that are gonna complexify the way we communicate with each other. Like when Google develops the telepathy app, it's just gonna make it all a mess again. But we're just in an emergent media moment that I think makes for harsh conflict, but also a lot of creativity and solution finding. Last remarks. Dr. E.
So about listening, I pay my bills listening to a lot of people. So I suppose I'm somewhat of an expert. When you really listen to someone, you have to then allow a major shift to happen emotionally, because what you think creates emotions. So when you really listen to that person, you have to brace yourself that you're going to experience some emotions that you were surprised that you had, like empathy, or just feeling able to relate to that person, whatever their views may be. And what I say is, trust your moral compass, that even if you shift in ways you didn't want to in the beginning, or that you move in ways that you thought would never happen, trust your moral compass that at the end of the day, you'll come back and find your way. And so as a therapist, hearing a lot of narratives and stories and views that I've never heard before, or that I don't relate to, when I soak them in like a sponge, I do feel myself move. I start questioning, what do I believe? What do I think is right? Who am I going to vote for? And at the end of the day, I trust, it takes practice. I'm going to go ahead eventually and find my way. and just trust my moral compass that'll guide me. And I believe Berkeley students have an awesome, awesome navigation skills. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wu, Jill, Carol.
I think we have, are we on here?